In the heart of the Arctic Circle lay a forgotten village untouched by modernity, its name long erased from maps. Winter reigned eternal here, a freezing prison where the sun hid for months at a time. The residents called it the month of givings, a period where survival depended on unity, or so they said. Elizabeth and her family had moved to the town just before December, drawn by the promise of cheap land and work opportunities her husband, Jack, had found online. The locals were welcoming at first, showering them with gifts of homemade bread, carved trinkets, and jars of preserved food. "Father Frost bless you this season," the mayor, a wiry man named Magnus, said, as he handed Jack a basket brimming with wine bottles. "We're glad to have fresh faces, but remember, community is everything here." Elizabeth didn't think much of the warning. She was more focused on settling her children, Lucy, 7, and Daniel, 5, into their new lives. The nights were long, the winds howling like banshees against the thin walls of their new home, but the family adapted quickly. That was, until the first gift arrived. It came in a plain wooden box, left at their doorstep on December 15th. Inside, wrapped in crimson-stained burlap, was the head of a fox. Its mouth was frozen in a grotesque snarl, and its milky eyes seemed to follow Elizabeth as she recoiled in horror. A note was attached, written in spidery handwriting. "One must always give to Father Frost." Elizabeth showed it to Jack, who dismissed it as a macabre prank. "Small-town hazing," he said, tossing the box into the trash. "We're outsiders, they're testing us." But Elizabeth couldn't shake the unease creeping up her spine. The gifts kept coming. The next was a jar of teeth, yellowed and cracked, unmistakably human. Then came a bundle of tiny frozen fingers. Jack tried to reassure her, insisting it was just a sick joke, but his bravado cracked when Lucy woke up screaming one night, claiming she'd seen a man watching her through the frosted window. "He was so big, Mommy," Lucy whispered, trembling in her mother's arms. "His face was all wrong, like it melted." Elizabeth felt her heart drop. She checked every window and door, but there was no sign of anyone outside, only the endless white expanse of snow under a pale moon. By Christmas Eve, the town's sinister traditions became impossible to ignore. Magnus invited the family to a grand feast in the town hall, where every villager gathered. The hall was adorned with strange decorations, wreaths made of animal bones, candles dripping with what looked like blood, and a massive ice sculpture of a figure that resembled both Santa Claus and a demon. Its grin stretched too wide, and its hands held chains instead of gifts. "Who's that supposed to be?" Jack asked uneasily. Magnus chuckled, his teeth gleaming like a wolf's. "Father Frost, he protects us from the eternal winter. We thank him by offering a gift each year." Elizabeth's stomach churned. "What kind of gift?" Magnus raised his glass, ignoring the question. "To the month of giving. May our offerings keep us safe." The villagers cheered, their voices blending into an unsettling cacophony. That night, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. As the clock struck midnight, she heard faint whispers outside. She peeked through the curtains and saw figures in the distance, hooded and carrying lanterns, marching toward the town square. Curiosity overcame her. She bundled herself in a coat and crept outside, careful not to wake Jack or the kids. She followed the procession, her breath clouding in the frigid air. The villagers gathered in a circle around a single figure, a young woman bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Magnus stood at the center, holding a ceremonial dagger. "We give so that we may live," he declared, plunging the blade into the woman's chest. Blood sprayed across the snow, steaming in the cold. The villagers chanted as the woman's lifeless body was dragged to a large crack in the ice and thrown into the abyss. Elizabeth stumbled back, bile rising in her throat. She fled to her home, her mind racing. On Christmas morning, Magnus knocked on their door. His smile was cheerful, but his eyes were cold. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Elizabeth clutched her children protectively. Jack stood between them and Magnus, his fists clenched. "We know you saw the ceremony last night," Magnus said casually, as if discussing the weather. "It's important you understand. This is how we survive. The creature beneath the ice, Father Frost, is real. If we don't feed it, it will come for us all." "This is insane," Jack spat. "We're leaving." Magnus shook his head. "You can't. The storm won't let you, and if you try, Father Frost will ensure you never make it past the woods." Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. "What do you want from us?" Magnus smiled that wolfish grin again. "You're new here, Elizabeth. Every new family must participate. This year we've chosen you as the offering." The week leading up to New Year's Eve was a nightmare. The family tried to flee, but every road out of town was blocked by snowdrifts. Their attempts to call for help were met with static. Meanwhile, the villagers became increasingly hostile, leaving warnings on their doorstep. Butchered animals, blood-smeared messages that read, "Run and you'll die screaming." Elizabeth noticed Lucy whispering to someone who wasn't there. When pressed, the girl admitted she'd been talking to Father Frost. "He's so sad, Mommy," Lucy said. "He doesn't like the gifts they give him. He wants something real." On New Year's Eve, the family made one last desperate attempt to escape. They packed their car and drove through the blizzard, but after hours of driving, they found themselves back at the town square. It was as if the storm had herded them back. The villagers were waiting, torches in hand. Magnus ordered the family out of the car, and when Jack resisted, they dragged him out and beat him unconscious. Elizabeth and her children were forced to the town square, where the ice sculpture of Father Frost loomed larger than ever. "This is the way it must be," Magnus intoned. "Elizabeth will appease him, and you'll be free to live here in peace." "No!" Elizabeth screamed as they bound her hands and feet. Lucy cried, clinging to her mother, but a villager tore her away. Magnus raised the dagger. But before he could strike, the ice beneath the sculpture cracked with a deafening roar. A freezing wind howled as a monstrous figure emerged, a towering amalgamation of skeletal remains, animalistic claws, and a face that melted and reformed like molten wax. Its eyes burned like embers, and its chains rattled with every step. The villagers screamed, but there was nowhere to run. Father Frost tore through them, ripping limbs from bodies and dragging their writhing forms into the abyss beneath the ice. Blood painted the snow crimson as Elizabeth struggled against her bonds. The creature stopped before her, its fiery eyes boring into hers. It leaned down, and in a voice like grinding ice it spoke. "They lied to you. I never asked for gifts. I asked for justice." The chains that bound it snapped, and the creature turned its wrath on the town. Buildings were crushed under its weight, and the villagers' screams echoed into the night as they were consumed. By dawn, the village was no more, just a smoldering ruin buried in snow. Elizabeth, Jack, and the children were the only survivors. As they fled the desolate landscape, Lucy turned to her mother and whispered, "He says thank you. He'll rest now." Elizabeth didn't respond. She didn't dare look back. The legend of the 13th month would die with that cursed village, but the memory of Father Frost's vengeance would haunt Elizabeth forever.